There is no cosmopolitanism without universalism, by Daniel Chernilo. The cosmopolitan turn in the social sciences over the past 20 years has been an exciting and welcome move. Exciting because it was able within a reasonably short period of time to bring together a variety of scholarly traditions and focus them on the conceptual and normative challenges of our current global modernity. Welcome because despite excesses and shortcomings, it has decidedly contributed to the critique of different essentialist, chauvinist, and indeed nationalistic ways of thinking that have been present throughout the history of the social sciences. Chernilo, Delanty, Fine, Turner. Cosmopolitanism is now a common term within a number of different scholarly communities and intellectual traditions. Look no further than this very compendium that now celebrates the publication of a second edition. One note of caution is needed, however. Recent socio-political events, Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and the so-called, quote, alt-right, end quote, etc., offer a clear warning that this is no time for complacency. The last thing we want is a repetition of the, quote, rise and fall, end quote, of globalization theories of the turn of the century, that the excitement and critical spirit of cosmopolitanism fades well before it was able to ascertain more fully its intellectual agenda. My goal in this paper is to offer a reassessment of what I consider is cosmopolitanism's most vexing issue, its interconnections with the question of universalism. The paper's key argument is that the core of the cosmopolitanism project lies in its claim to universalism. Whether we understand cosmopolitan developments as constitutive elements of our contemporary socio-historical landscape, or we see them more as regulative ideas that are needed in order to defend certain principles that by definition will never be fully actualized, it is my contention that thinking in cosmopolitan terms compels us to favor a universalistic orientation. In doing this, we'll have to criticize the ways in which previous universalistic arguments have been deployed and justified, but these criticisms shall ultimately turn into forms of self-criticism at the core of cosmopolitanism as an intellectual project in the redefinition and refinement rather than the abandonment of cosmopolitanism's universalistic orientation. There is no genuine cosmopolitan position without a universalistic orientation that upholds an all-encompassing idea of humanity. Archer, 2000, Arendt, 1998, Chernilo, 2017. In what follows, I will discuss four of the most common charges against cosmopolitan universalism. The problem of cosmopolitan universalism's, quote, original locale, end quote, of, quote, stability, end quote, of, quote, reification, end quote, and of, quote, idealism, end quote. After exploring this, quote, problematic centrality, end quote, of universalism and cosmopolitan thinking in the opening section of the paper, the second section, quote, early cosmopolitan thinking, the problem of particular origins and stability, end quote, deals with the first two of these charges. The argument there is that right from their inception, universalistic arguments had to engage with questions about their own origins, as well as those universalistic arguments' ability to account for socio-historical variation and normative disagreement. The next section, quote, the rise of modern cosmopolitanism, Immanuel Kant, and the charges of reification and idealism, end quote, then deals with the questions of reification and idealism, and addresses the questions of reification and idealism by looking at Immanuel Kant's cosmopolitan and moral thinking. It is in Kant's decided proceduralization of universalism, on the one hand, and Kant's view of how moral universalism is compatible with the all too real artistic motivations of individuals, on the other, that a universalistic orientation renews itself and remains a fundamental resource for contemporary cosmopolitan thinking. The problematic centrality of universalism in cosmopolitan thinking. The claim that universalism has been a central tenet of the contemporary social sciences is most commonly used as an indictment on their current shortcomings and the lessons they have missed. Take for instance Richard Rorty's 2009 view that through its commitment to universalism, quote, the Plato-Kant canon, end quote, that lies at the center of modern thought has been hugely damaging, both intellectually and politically. More closely related to the specific concerns of this article, Raewyn Connell identified universalism as one of the major shortcomings of, quote, grand social theory, end quote, that has led to an absolute neglect of colonialism in mainstream sociology. More poignantly, and in startling reversal of Kant's ideas of universal hospitality to be discussed below, Raewyn Connell argues that the idea of terra nullius, a land belonging to nobody, which stood at the central of the, quote, colonizer's dream, is a sinister presupposition for social science, end quote. In postmodernism and postcolonialism alike, then, universalism is seen as wholly problematic. Universalism can never be adequately justified. Universalism is mistaken. Universalism is to be rejected everywhere in any shape or form, and pernicious. Universalism is a wolf dressed up like a sheep from which nothing good comes out. Philosopher Leo Strauss, a critic of developments in American social science during the 20th century, offers what is perhaps a more insightful comment on the question of universalism. Strauss's argument is that a fundamental aporia inheres in American social science, because whereas on the one hand the problem of universalism is indeed central to social science, on the other hand, a positivistic self-conception distorts what is genuinely at stake. Strauss puts the question thus, quote, however much the science of all cultures may protest its innocence, of all preferences or evaluations, the science of all cultures fosters a specific moral posture. Since the science of all cultures requires openness to all cultures, the science of all cultures fosters universal tolerance and the exhilaration deriving from the beholding of diversity. The science of all cultures fosters universal tolerance. Oh, shit. Rereading this sentence. The science of all cultures necessarily affects all cultures that it can still affect by contributing to their transformation in one and the same direction. The science of all cultures willy-nilly brings about a shift of emphasis from the particular to the universal, by asserting, if only implicitly, the rightness of pluralism. The science of all cultures asserts that pluralism is the right way. The science of all cultures asserts that the monism of universal tolerance and respect for diversity. For by virtue of being an ism, pluralism is a monism. End quote. Leo Strauss. Strauss wrote this commentary as an indictment on the social sciences' recent developments. For Strauss, it constitutes a definitive demonstration of the futility of the modern and empirical study of social life, because of its restrictive view of what constitutes genuine knowledge of human affairs. Strauss's regressive solution of seeking to go back to the ancient texts of philosophy, Western and non-Western, as the repository of true knowledge, is not the path I should like to follow, but I do think that we need to take seriously his twofold insight. A, that a universalistic orientation is built into the ways in which our social scientific concepts actually operate, and B, that the justification of universalistic arguments shall remain tentative and problematic. As soon as we suspend the inevitability Strauss attaches to his critique of 20th century social science, his reflections become more instructive with regard to the significance of universalism in contemporary cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitan approaches require a strongly universalistic conception of humanity that cannot be justified in terms that are acceptable for conventional scientific claims. They must bring together scientific and philosophical knowledge claims. Chernilo, 2014-2017. If that is the case, therefore, the problem faced by cosmopolitan thinking is that its very universalism challenges some of the shortcomings that are constitutive of the same social scientific program. If that is the case, therefore, the problem faced by cosmopolitan thinking is that its very universalism challenges some of the shortcomings that are constitutive of the same social scientific program it now seeks to embrace. If I am correct in this assessment, then these are the four main arguments that are raised against a universalistic orientation. Argument 1. The question of its original locale. The historical roots of universalistic ideas lie in the particular geographic and socio-cultural context of ancient Greece, and this, quote, Western, end quote, origin can never be transcended. Argument 2. The question of stability. Universalistic ideas emphasize unity, homogeneity, and necessity over difference, heterogeneity, and contingency. Therefore, universalistic ideas are fundamentally unable to account for historical change and socio-cultural variation. Argument 3. The question of reification. Universalism is always the generalization of a Western particular. Rather than being neutral, universalism systematically reifies those Western values, institutions, and forms of life that are closer to its original experiences. Argument 4. The question of idealism. Universalism is a lofty ideal nowhere to be found in empirical reality. It is therefore unable to account for such hard facts of life as people's egotistic motivations, their individual preferences, or even the power politics of states. I argue that these four criticisms do not capture what universalism is, and the role universalism plays in current understandings of cosmopolitanism. But these four criticisms are surely worth revisiting. In what follows, I address each one of them by sketching a different trajectory of the relationships between universalism and cosmopolitanism. Early cosmopolitan thinking, the problem of particular origins, and stability. The standard narrative has it that cosmopolitanism is a long-standing intellectual tradition that from the time of Stoic philosophy has defended ideas of universal belonging. At the center of cosmopolitanism's belief is the notion that our human membership takes precedence over the more particular aspects of our identities and or socio-political affiliations. Argument 1 above, the question of the, quote, Western, end quote, roots of cosmopolitanism is then a good starting point. A first argument that I should like to make, however, is to question whether and to what extent is this labeling of ancient philosophy as, quote, Western, end quote, adequate. The Stoic philosophical tradition we are talking about here predates the rise of the West itself. Although some of the texts that lie at its center, Diogenes and Cicero's works, have taken a relevant role in what later became known, in what later became the Western philosophical canon, we still seem to be imposing retrospectively a sense of historical mission that the texts themselves did not have. A politics of canon making, rather than of intellectual history, seems to be at stake here. And for that, it matters little whether the putative link between Greek philosophy, cosmopolitanism, and the, quote, West, end quote, is made in celebratory or denunciative mode. But the issue goes beyond the underlying logic of cosmopolitanism's putative origins. The actual implications of this standard view can be questioned. We now know that whatever that can be termed as particularly, quote, Western, end quote, in early cosmopolitan thinking, its universalistic orientation was not one of such elements. A full account of this trajectory is beyond what I can offer, but historian of political ideas Eric Voegelin has systematically argued that a strong universalistic orientation was in fact central to all known world religions. Building on Karl Jasper's idea of an axial age from circa 800 to 200 BC, with a concentration about 500 when Confucius, the Buddha, and Heraclitus were contemporaries, end quote, ideas of universal humanity developed independently and were already in place in different cultural settings. Voegelin. The core of Voegelin's argument is that a universalistic orientation was already being imported to the, quote, West, end quote. Quote, the idea of a universal God, for instance, achieved its specific purity through the mystic philosophers, but its existence embedded in a compact cosmological myth is attested by Egyptian inscriptions about 3000 BC. Quite crucially, as this is something that will reappear below in my argument, Voegelin suggests that a universalistic orientation has always been difficult to separate from imperial aspirations. Quote, all the early empires, Near East as well as Far Eastern, understood themselves as representatives of a transcendent order, the order of the cosmos, and some of them even understood this order as a, quote, truth, end quote. The empire is a cosmic analog, a little world reflecting the order of the great comprehensive world, end quote. Voegelin, or Voegelin. The validity of argument 1 depends, therefore, on an anachronistic, self-conscious, endogenous idea of, quote, Western philosophy, end quote, that had to be in place before the rise of the very idea of the West. Rather the opposite. The uniqueness and originality of what has later become, quote, Greek philosophy, end quote, needs to be explained in the context of the various intellectual and religious influences it received. The alleged validity of argument 1 becomes The alleged validity of argument 1 turns out to be the combination between a, quote, certain fallacy of origins, end quote, universalism's origins account for universalism's inability to deal with non-Western phenomenon, and a, quote, methodological territorialism, end quote, in the sense that intellectual influences can be adequately limited as uniquely belonging to self-contained geographical areas or socio-political units, but neither proposition really holds. Argument 2 focuses on the accusation that a universalistic orientation exaggerates notions of social stability. Crucially, the validity of this critique remains even if argument 1, on its origins, proves to be less ethnocentric than previously assumed. If universalism requires ideas of unity and homogeneity, then this raises legitimate doubts over its potential for understanding current social processes. Unpacking argument 2 requires us to interrogate whether and how a universalistic orientation is able to handle such issues as historical change, sociocultural variation, and normative disagreement. The counter-argument that I would like to make here is that however dogmatic an early universalistic orientation may have been, it was still based on the empirical recognition that life is only lived through life's multiple variations and particularities. This is how German sociologist and theologian Ernst Troeltsch put it at the beginning of the 20th century. Quote, "The Stoic legal and social philosophy is, like the entire Stoic ethic, a product of the disintegration of the ancient polis and the world kingdom of a created cosmopolitan horizon. In place of positive law morality emerges the ethic derived from a universal law-abiding reason. In place of the national interests of his native country, Heimat, the individual is fulfilled by God's reason. In place of the single political connection is the idea of humanity that lacks differentiation in terms of state and place, race and color. From this human ideal comes a fully free Gemeinschaft or community." End quote. Troeltsch. His argument is twofold here. On the one side, he emphasizes that a sense of universality in early cosmopolitan thinking was made possible because of the acute sense of diversity, change, and disagreement that came as a result of the actual, quote, disintegration of the ancient polis, end quote. On the other side, he asserts that this new way of looking at human affairs has a certain self-propelling capacity. The more it recognizes difference, the more it sought to foster a new sense of unity. The key point seems to be that there is a real gap between the actual historical conditions of crises that made the appearance of universalism possible and the explicit admission that universalistic ideas must work at the level of ideal projections. In terms of rejecting argument 2, on stability, then, it is my contention that rather than stability, universalistic ideas emerge out of an acute awareness of diversity and conflict. The significance of a universalistic orientation may be assessed differently in normative terms, but its relevance lies neither in some ideal conception of, quote, human nature, end quote, nor in that actual socio-historical condition corresponding with a somehow definitive sense of cultural unity. Universalism is a way of, quote, imagining, end quote, a strong sense of unity, because current conditions precisely emphasize, on the contrary, difference, conflict, and change. Arendt. Reinhard Koselleck has also reflected on relationships between universalistic ideas and the problem of stability. Reinhard Koselleck looked into the historical experiences of ancient Greece. Koselleck noted the gap between newly born universalistic ideals and the clear consciousness that these ideals are impossible to realize in the actual organization of socio-political life. Koselleck argues that the central innovation of Stoic philosophy was that of universalism taking a sharper conceptual character. The early cosmopolitan program did not focus on an idea of a world state or single political community. Rather, its stake was a philosophical principle that sought to rearrange theoretically our understanding of who we are as human beings, the idea of a singular human species that is constituted through that species' diversity. Such a rearrangement, moreover, was still wholly embedded in a strict separation between ambits of human action that were susceptible of human intervention and design, not least among them political life itself, and those that are organized on transcendental or natural conditions. Quote, the Stoics considered the cosmos governed by Logos as their home in which all humankind, freeman and slave, Hellene and Oriental, just as much as the gods and the stars had a part. Political agencies were built into the cosmopolis, although the Stoics could never have identified the supervening with the empirical order. We do not have here mutually exclusive concepts, but rather supplementary concepts of varying magnitude, which are intended to mediate between the political tasks of the day and the general philosophical apprehension of the world. End quote. Kozelek. Against the idea of stability that underpins argument 2, a universalistic orientation emerged while seeking to understand particular crises. The early universalism emerged with a sense of mission that surely favored the rearrangement and overcoming of differences among social groupings at a, quote, higher level, end quote, i.e. not in actual political life, but in the realm of thinking. As particularities were up to that point being conceived of as naturally or divinely construed, the connections between universalism and particularism still remained unmediated. First, because the particular belonged in actual socio-political life, while the universal only inhabited in the realm of ideals. Second, because proposals for making particularities compatible with a sense of universal human belonging could not be justified in hierarchical, i.e. in natural or divine terms. To that extent, therefore, it has been suggested that when writers like Cicero talked about the, quote, common society of the human race, end quote, Cicero may have meant little more than this, that there is a kind of mutual recognition between men which differs from the relationship between men and the rest of the natural world, end quote. Tuck, 1999. Equally importantly, although this, quote, thin, end quote, universalism distinguishes between a human and a natural world, it nonetheless, quote, seems to have tentatively associated the notion of human society with that of natural slavery. Writers of the Hellenistic and Roman period were unhappy with the fully fledged Aristotelian account of the natural slave. But they were quite prepared to argue for the forcible enslavement of those who, quote, violated the common code of mankind, end quote, end quote. Tuck. The argument is illustrative of the ambivalent yet persistent connection between philosophical arguments about universalism and their political implications in terms of slavery and empires. These linkages are, of course, central to post-colonial criticisms. These linkages have remained a recurring problem, but they need not be seen as a necessary condition for cosmopolitan universalism. If anything, what transpires here is that a universalistic orientation goes against any axiomatic limitation of general ideas of human nature, i.e., everyone is a human being, even if such limitations can then be reintroduced for political gain, i.e., the punishment of certain actions places some groups outside the human family. In other words, a key modernizing move of this early cosmopolitan tradition is accomplished when universalism is no longer able to uphold transcendental or naturalistic hierarchies between individuals and groups of people. Particular forms of life and identities, indeed, all kinds of differences need now to be seen as the result of human action and human action alone. From this time on, universalism becomes a fully immanent frame of reference. It is treated as a social fact rather than as the result of natural differences or divine indictments. Kozelek shows that it was Diogenes, rather early on, who, quote, coined the universalistic, quote, cosmopolite, end quote, with the object of transcending the usual dualism between Hellenes and barbarians. Yet things are never simple, and also within this new unity, this dualism was then, quote, recast, without relinquishing the continued division of all humanity into Hellenes and barbarians. The distinction that had formerly been made spatially came to be deployed horizontally as a universalistic criterion of differentiation. Hellene was a person with sufficient education, whether Greek or non-Greek, who merely had to be able to speak proper Greek. The remainder were barbarians. Thus this new antithesis, which was organized around education, no longer derived from natural qualities. In this context, the counter-concepts were denaturalized and stripped of all spatial connections, end quote. The boundaries between those who qualify and those who do not qualify as human beings is now reattempted horizontally. That is, they are drawn through human means and human means alone. In turn, this means that new exclusions can only be created and overcome by the same route, politics and education being the two most relevant vehicles for reshaping the cultural status of particular groups. Conversely, cosmological justifications no longer do, as the distinction between who is and who isn't a human being can no longer be based on an individual's natural features, and the question of people's geographical location also becomes increasingly superfluous. The critical threshold that has been overcome, and the key argument to reject, argument 2, is that while emphasizing particularities remains central to the construction of universalistic arguments, there is now a clear awareness that they both are actually grounded on social relations themselves. To that extent, they may still be able to provide justification for unfair institutions such as slavery or imperialism, but the threshold itself of universal human belonging is now fully social and historical. Equally, crucially, universalism now integrates a principle of inclusivity that depends on education, values, and institutions that are themselves made by human beings. The critique of argument 3 on reification remains: why does it have to be Greek education and language? And in order to address this, we still have to consider Kant's procedural turn. But universalism's self-propelling openness has been firmly established. The human species can now genuinely commence to conceive itself as one. Let me recapitulate my argument so far. Against argument 1, I question that Greek classical philosophy is regarded as unproblematically Western, and also that the rise of universalism be explicated as an endogenous, quote, Western, end quote, development. Against argument 2, moreover, I showed that early concerns with universalism were not dismissive or antithetical to socio-historical transformations. Instead, they actually emerged from the recognition of the difficulties that develop over sustained periods of crisis. The universalistic orientation of early cosmopolitanism was built on the notion that conflicts and disagreements are ubiquitous in actual political life, and that differences among groups were naturally rather than socio-culturally construed. Eventually, however, universalism became more and more imminent as universalism begins to understand the particularities of human beings, they themselves being human-made. These universalistic ideas are attempts to think of the solution to social crises by redefining the terms within which we are able to think our common membership to the human species, how humans are able to imagine an increasingly wider and potentially universal sense of belonging. In the terms of the four arguments I am interested in critiquing, then, we have seen that neither an original locale, argument 1, nor the problem of stability, argument 2, constitutes a necessary element of cosmopolitanism's universalism. Both can be overcome even within a relatively conventional narrative of what are the main features of a cosmopolitan outlook. But argument 3 on reification has not been addressed yet because although universalism is now fully immanent, its contents are fixated on particular kinds of education, e.g. the ability to speak of particular language or master a particular intellectual canon. A fundamental tension is set thus. There are some socially and culturally specific features that reinforce the discrimination against those who do not possess the right credentials, but because they are defined in social and cultural terms rather than in natural terms, these hierarchies can now potentially be overcome even from within. In the next section, then, I discuss how Immanuel Kant's cosmopolitan approach redefines this universalistic orientation as he sought to deal with the challenges that remain. The rise of modern cosmopolitanism. Immanuel Kant and the charges of reification and idealism. The significance of Kant for this exploration lies in that his work is explicitly concerned with the interconnections between universalism and cosmopolitanism. My goal in this brief piece cannot be to offer an exhaustive account of Kant's arguments on these issues. Rather, I should like to use his writings in order to reconsider the two charges of reification and idealism. Kant's idea of cosmopolitanism centers on the idea of a, quote, civil society which can administer justice universally, end quote. And he treats the challenge as, quote, the most difficult and the last, end quote, question to be solved by human beings. Following a long-standing tradition of political thinking that thought that domestic and international levels are mutually and fundamentally interrelated, Kant's notion of universal justice applies to increasingly global developments that he thought would favor peaceful and lawful relations at the domestic, interstate, and global or cosmopolitan levels. Contrary to Connell's crude argument I mentioned in the openings, and in direct connection to the question of imperialism and slavery, Kant locates hospitality at the center of its cosmopolitan program. He defines hospitality as, quote, the right of a stranger not to be treated with hostility when he arrives on someone else's territory, end quote. So, crucially, this is a principle of hospitality that establishes limits to what people can and cannot do as they arrive in a foreign land. They ought to be treated peacefully by the locals, but visitors have no right to stay indefinitely, nor are they allowed to pillage or force the country into submission. Rather, the opposite. Kant's commitment to a principle of hospitality is a way of making all individuals the fundamental bearer of rights, irrespective of their nationality, within as much as beyond Europe. Kant justifies the universal application of these principles also on empirical grounds, since, quote, the earth is a globe, end quote. He justifies the universal application of these principles also on empirical grounds, because, quote, since the earth is a globe, end quote, human beings, quote, cannot disperse over an infinite area, but must necessarily tolerate one another's company. and no one originally has any greater right than anyone else to occupy any particular portion of the earth, end quote. Kant's cosmopolitan program offers an explicit criticism to the behavior of European colonizers at the time. Kant then brings his ideas of universal justice down to earth, as it were, through the notion of perpetual peace. Kant offers the following provisional articles: peace treaties shall not include secret clauses that may lead to future wars. States, Article 1, states cannot be purchased, inherited, or exchanged by other states. Article 2, standing armies are to be gradually abolished. Article 3, states shall not incur into debts to fund wars. Article 4, states should not intervene in the constitution of other states. Article 5, and actions during wartime should not prevent trust to reemerge in future times of peace. Article 6. To these, Kant adds 3 definitive articles that interrelate closely to the domestic, international, and cosmopolitan levels. These articles seek to secure, first, the rational organization of states at the domestic level. Second, the international alliances be voluntary, and will not lead to the rise of a despotic world state. And third, that there are some human rights to be upheld by all states, irrespective of the individual's nationality. Much has been said about Kant's cosmopolitan writings, but this much is now clear. In relation to the questions of empire and slavery, he makes a cosmopolitan outlook a key element of their critique. The universalistic orientation of Kant's thought makes individuals bearers of rights irrespective of those individuals' state affiliation, and claims to occupy lands or to enslave peoples become morally unjustifiable. As I shall seek to demonstrate below, moreover, it is the procedural logic of Kant's categorical imperative, in the sense of treating human beings as ends rather than means, that is crucial for this transformation. There is a self-propelling logic of inclusivity that underwrites Kant's universalistic orientation. Kant's idea of universal justice finds an additional expression in Kant's attempt at the radical reformulation of philosophy as being based exclusively on immanent grounds, an idea of justice that is the human-made recognition of rights that humans grant to each other as humans. Universal justice is now to do with the rules through which we decide about the morality of laws and actions, so that laws and actions are based on rational grounds. What Kant has made here, then, is to focus on how this universalistic orientation reinforces a fully immanent account of human knowledge and morality. But it is also worth mentioning that Kant's views on the need for universalistic orientation was already unpopular among his contemporaries. He was well aware of the fact that, quote, if votes were collected as to which is to be preferred, pure rational cognition separated from anything empirical, hence metaphysics of morals, or popular practical philosophy, one can guess at once on which side the preponderance would fall, end quote. Kant. The reasons behind this lack of sympathy towards universalism have less to do with universalism's non-religious connotations and more with arguments 3 on reification and 4 on idealism. And we need to address these directly now. Being formulated at the dawn of modernity, the categorical imperative of morality is central to Kant's explicit engagement with universalism. It already reflects an enhanced sense of historical, religious, and socio-cultural diversity. Kant was aware that attempts to determine positively the definitive or substantive contents of the good life were hugely problematic, if not outright impossible. The epoch-making importance of the categorical imperative, therefore, lies precisely in the fact that it is a decisive innovation towards the radical proceduralization of previous universalistic arguments, namely the idea that morality cannot and will not be defined through positive commands to act in a particular way, but through the justifications of certain maxims or actions as valid for everyone. A general procedure that allows us to reflect on how we arrive at specific moral or even legal justifications. The categorical imperative replaces the use of specific concerns with the reasons and rules that allow us to arrive at particular moral decisions. In its classical formulation, then, the categorical imperative states, quote, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that maxim become a universal law. As he expands on it, Kant adds two further dimensions to it. The regulative role of the idea of humanity and the notion that human beings be treated always as ends in themselves and never as means. Kant then reformulates the categorical imperative thus, quote, act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means, end quote. The universalistic standpoint of Kant's moral philosophy becomes fully apparent when, in this rejection of the idea of standing armies, his views went beyond the fact that more professional soldiers made wars more likely. The first crucial factor for Kant is instead the fundamentally dehumanizing, indeed immoral rationale for the creation of professional armies. Quote, the hiring of men to kill or to be killed seems to mean using men as mere machines and instruments in the hand of someone else, the state, which cannot be easily reconciled with the right of man in one's own person, end quote. Kant. Kant's proposals are not free of problems. The charge of formalism is possibly the most notable one, as it concentrates on the fact that its a priori foundation and somewhat solipsistic formulation obtain in a restrictive view of what constitutes adequate moral reasons. Hegel. But its long-lasting contribution lies in that its procedural dimension allows for Kant's But its long-standing contribution lies in that its procedural dimension allows for its dialogic underpinnings to be unpacked from within, as it were. The very possibility of thinking about the generalization of moral maxims implies that different individual views and social positions have to be taken into account. Furthermore, the categorical imperative offers a way of thinking about moral issues that accepts the universalistic potential of particular cultural contents, always provisionally. In other words, it is the open-ended nature of the procedure that may require us to revise the grounds on which we justify some cultural contents as potentially valid for humanity as a whole. Freedom of association is universally valid, whilst discrimination on religious grounds is not universally valid. Crucially, criticisms of specific institutions or practices are not raised on behalf of abstract principles. Much more often, criticisms of specific institutions or practices emerge from very concrete concerns: the end of slavery, equal pay for men and women, the widening of the political franchise, asylum laws, etc. In so doing, the categorical imperative connects our individual concerns with the widest possible sense of human belonging. In relation to argument 3, therefore, Kant has found in the proceduralization of universalism the key with which to unlock the problem of reification. It is this universalistic orientation that favors an ever wider sense of inclusion for all human beings. In relation to argument 4 on idealism, finally, we can see how Kant addresses it through his discussion of current ideas of human nature. He was unmoved by projects that sought to positively define human nature as the necessary step for understanding morality. Too much had already been said about human nature, and too little had been agreed on what human nature actually was. Quote, "One will find now the special determination of human nature, now perfection, now happiness, here moral feeling, there fear of God, a bit of this and also a bit of that in a marvelous mixture, without its occurring to them to ask whether the principles of morality are to be sought at all in acquaintance with human nature." End quote. Kant. In fact, Kant thought that the project of positively determining the content of universal human nature was systematically flawed. It was just foolish to look for definite conceptions of human nature with a view to univocally deriving moral commands from it. Kant saw two different problems here. On the one hand, such attempts would reintroduce the kind of substantive considerations that the categorical imperative sought to undermine. The idea that there is such a thing as a definite notion of human nature still has not quite understood that the categorical imperative, quote, has to do not with the matter of the action and what is to result from the action, but with the form and the principle from which the action itself follows, end quote. On the other hand, he argued that we should never take people's views about the morality of their own actions as the real measure of their motivations. Human beings are neither angels nor purely rational beings. Ironically, Kant contends that, quote, we like to flatter ourselves by falsely attributing to ourselves a nobler motive, whereas in fact we can never, even by the most strenuous self-examination, get entirely behind our covert incentives, since when moral worth is at issue, what counts is not actions, which one sees, but those inner principles of action that one does not see, end quote. In relation to argument 4 on idealism, therefore, this contradicts the view that there is no room in moral universalism for the real passions, minutiae, or ugliness of everyday life. The fact that moral universalism remains distinct from empirical motivations and urges does not make moral universalism any less real. Kant's idea of human beings, quote, unsocial sociability, end quote, is in fact an attempt to acknowledge both the selfish and individualistic side of our life alongside its cooperative and collaborative one. They pull our actions in different directions but are equally real. It is just not the case that in order to work, universalism needs a wholly unrealistic or essential conception of human nature, one that sees human beings as fully devoid of conflicting needs and motivational complications. Nor does a notion of, quote, abstract morality, end quote, underpin the psychological motivations that are needed for moral actions to take place. Rather, the opposite. Kant's argument is that a universalistic orientation is built into the very possibility of moral thinking, as it actually happens among real people. We are not purely moral beings, but our moral sensibility and imagination is a fundamental aspect of our life as a human species. Universalism lies at the center of our real ability to think of ourselves beyond ourselves and as members of a single humanity. It combines rather than opposes people's sense of duty with the motivations that come from their particular needs and interests. And last but not least, it puts forward a conception of justice in which human beings are bearers of inalienable rights and ought to be treated with dignity irrespective of their national or other particular affiliations. The world can, of course, work and be experienced beyond such moral grounds, but our understanding of it is incomplete if we lack the universalistic sense that is offered by a cosmopolitan orientation. Closing remarks. In the little space I have left, I should like to spell out some of the main implications of my argument. 1. Contemporary cosmopolitanism has no ritual debt to pay to its predecessors, nor does contemporary cosmopolitanism necessarily have to engage with its long and far from unproblematic history. But if we miss some of their more important insights, we end up arguing from below the critical standards that have actually been achieved in terms of understanding the ways in which human beings have become able to see each other as bearers of inalienable rights. There is still much to learn on past understandings of cosmopolitanism, and universalism remains its most fundamental insight. 2. Favoring a universalistic orientation has never been the people's choice. Serious difficulties are to be confronted when seeking to deploy universalistic arguments, and here I identified 4 of them: original locale, stability, reification, and idealism. They pose a real challenge. There is no definitive way of overcoming them, and yet they are best confronted from within. Stating that universalism is intrinsically Western is both anachronistic and inaccurate. That it is essentially homogenizing denies universalism's internal connection with experiences of crises and social change. That universalism is bound to favor certain cultural contents obviates the radical implication of Kant's procedural turn, and that it is idealistic negates the reality of moral intuitions in the very definition of what we are as human beings. 3. The solutions we find to these challenges are not static, and new questions constantly emerge. It is inscribed in the self-propelling dynamic of universalism that, as better justifications and arguments are found, new questions, problems, and exclusions make themselves visible. Universalism remains a key intellectual resource which, far from being opposed to the identification of specificities and particularities, universalism creates the very framework within which recognition and acceptance becomes possible. Like it or not, there is just no cosmopolitanism without universalism.